All right, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Wednesday, June 4th, and let's start with Russia's retaliation to this strike. What do you think it's going to be? Is it ongoing right now? Have we seen anything come out of the Russian side, what they're going to do?
Well, first, I don't think there's been any official declaration that there will be retaliation. Correct me if I'm wrong. If you've seen it, I just haven't seen it yet. What the closest to some sort of official promise of retaliation was a tweet by Medvedev. But Medvedev is always sort of plays the role of Putin's evil twin brother, or or the bad cop in the good cop bad cop routine. So I don't know how much weight we should put on that. Um, I haven't heard Putin say anything about it. It's they have been, it seems to me, remarkably low key about this strike. They, say they're conducting an investigation. They haven't leveled any accusations. They haven't, again, to my knowledge, they haven't accused the CIA or any Western intelligence of involvement yet. Um, so there may be no retaliation. Now, if there is, and I think if the past is a guide, it may very well be just part of their regular strategy dressed up as a retaliation. We've seen them do that before. They go do that before. They've gone, ahead and struck the kind of facilities that they've struck before and then declare that this was our retaliation. Maybe it was a little bit more intense than in the past, something like that. That seems to be the way that Putin does things. Again, Putin is so cool, level-headed. He's level-headed to the point of, of infuriating a lot of the more warm-blooded people around him and a lot of his supporters and many observers. Um, I think the way he looks at it again is that he's got a winning strategy. He's going to stick with it. What I think, at least in part, what um, Ukraine is trying to do by these kind of provocations and strikes is to goad him into some sort of excessive reaction. That is, again, these strikes on the air bases, even though that the Russians describe them as terrorist attacks, they really weren't. I don't think that is an accurate description of them. But in general, like the rail bridge attack, and then also that road bridge over the rail. Those two attacks in Bryansk and Kursk. Those definitely you could characterize as terrorist attacks, and one of them had killed quite a few people, injured well over 100 people. That was a major terrorist attack. But that's just one example of many terrorist attacks that the Kiev regime has pulled off over the course of this conflict and before, starting back in 2014, really. Um, but the point of terrorism is well understood, not just terrorism by the Kiev regime, but by all terrorists, is to go the other side into some kind of overreaction. And the overreaction is the purpose of the attack. You could say that that's what what the U.S. did. When Bin Laden carried out the 9/11 attacks, we overreacted, and of course, that resulted in all kinds of death and destruction in Afghanistan and in the Middle East. But in the end, it probably hurt us. It hurt us more. Of course, Bin Laden eventually was captured, and Al Qaeda suffered, was nearly destroyed, but it's still around, or at least suffered very heavy losses. But we suffered losses too. It was a huge mistake. It was an overreaction on our part, and it it drained our treasury of trillions of dollars. And we know we don't have to go through the whole story, but you could say that in a way Bin Laden was successful. He goaded the U.S. into an overreaction, even though it resulted in his own death. And I think that's always part of terrorism. That's part of what the Ukrainians are trying to do. Now that, again, the attacks on the air bases weren't, I wouldn't say terroristic in nature, but they were provocations for the reasons that we've described. So I don't think we're going to see anything major. It seems like there's more heat being generated by this among online observers and supporters of Russia than by the Russian government itself. We'll have to wait and see. They're conducting an investigation. Maybe they'll come out, and say, make a very promised retaliation. And then, I would adjust my expectations accordingly.
Right. I think it's a little difficult to gauge the severity of this attack. We're hearing different things. On one, it's like this is a valid military target. From my understanding, these aircraft are being used to fire cruise missiles into Ukraine. So they're fair game. But then at the same time, we're hearing a lot of people saying that we're attacking Russia's nuclear triad and that this is a huge escalation and that Russia has the right to respond with nuclear force if we're doing something like this. And we hear things about the START Treaty or the SALT Treaty being in violation. So how do you gauge the severity of this attack? Was it just a valid military attack? I mean, if they are using it's dual use, how do you analyze it?
I guess I would kind of take the middle ground on this. Yeah, it was to a certain degree. These were valid military targets. Okay, these bombers, the Tu-95s, those were most of the bombers that were destroyed or damaged were Tu-95s. I think they're the equivalent, more or less, of our B-52s. They're rather old, but they can still carry out these missions. They were, you could describe them as dual use, meaning that they have been used in the war to fire, for example, KH-101 missiles, and fired many of them over the course of this war. So to that extent, yeah, they're fair game, but they also are nuclear capable and part of Russia's strategic bomber fleet. It's the third element in their triad of nuclear deterrence. So it is, yes, it's valid, but it's also provocative. You look at it and I wonder if there are some bombers. I believe it's the Tu-160. Has not been involved in the war and is kind of purely a strategic bomber. And if they had destroyed some of those, I think that would have been much more escalatory or provocative than this attack. I would say, again, I think both people are right about this to an extent. It is provocative. It does go, it's not like there's any chance that the Russians are going to respond with nuclear missiles to this, but you are kind of starting to push towards that nuclear threshold, with this. And that is scary. And again, I think it's, like I argued before, there's no question that the West knew about this. Western intelligence agencies knew about this, and they could have stopped it. They obviously have, because again, Kiev is so dependent on it, they could have stopped. They didn't. So they may have, at the very least, they supported it. They may have even conceived the idea and organized it and, been very heavily involved in it. All these things are possible. We just don't know. So it is worrying. It's an example. It's not I wouldn't say it's a huge step, a huge escalatory step. In fact, I would say, these missiles, the ATACMS that were fired into places like Kursk and Belgorod and Bryansk by when Biden was still president, those were really more escalatory. Those took us closer to World War III. And if that resumes, I think it would be more worrying than this development. But this is escalatory. It is provocative. It does, take us a little bit closer to World War III. But I wouldn't say it's really a major escalation, or it's not as large as I think some people are describing it. Now, you were mentioning the START Treaty. I think I just need to talk about that because you brought it up. Some people have said that those bombers had to be outside and on display as part of the START Treaty. And what I found, it took a while to figure it out, but I actually got the actual language of the treaty, the provision in question. And what it says is they need to be out there during inspections. It's like, every once there are inspections that are agreed upon between the two parties or specified by the treaty. And when those inspections are conducted, that all the bombers have to be outside of their hangars or their concrete bunkers, and, so that they can be, so they're fully visible and both sides will know exactly how many bombers the other side has. Now, So I don't think anybody's arguing. In fact, there could not have been an inspection going on when this attack was made, because um, um, Russia suspended part of that treaty back in 2023. And the part that they suspended was, they said we're no longer going to allow inspections, monitoring. The reason is that clearly the U.S. was conducting a proxy war against them. And they said, you're basically conducting a war against us. We're not going to let you visit our bases while this is going on. And I think that was a very reasonable position on the part of the Russians. So they said, so we're out of that part of the treaty is no longer in effect. The other part of the treaty, limiting the number of strategic nuclear forces, is still in effect, and both sides are abiding by those provisions. But that whole thing about the bombers having to be on display during inspection, that actually is no longer in effect. That was not required by the treaty. So the fact that they were out there had nothing to do with START. It's just that the Russians had not taken measures to protect those bombers.
Okay, it's good to get that cleared up. It's amazing how things can take a while to get verified. Because so many people were saying this. I was just okay.
Right. No, I noticed the same thing. A lot of very authoritative, very, very intelligent people. But it's easy to do. You kind of, one authoritative source says it, and you say, well, this guy must know. But everybody makes mistakes. Very smart, very knowledgeable people make mistakes, and then we do have this ecosystem on the, let's say the among geopolitical dissidents, and we've learned to rely on different sources, which I think we all have to do, and these sources in general are very reliable, but everybody makes mistakes, and I think that's what happened in this case. So I was rather confused because I was hearing so and so and so all saying this, but actually managed to get to the actual language and to learn the history of the treaty. There's no question, that that's not what was going on. They weren't out there because they had to be out there according to the treaty. They were just out there.
Have we heard anything from the Trump administration with regards to this?
No, I don't think we have. That's really quite remarkable. So, we ought to. Maybe there's a lot of wondering, again, I think no question that the Western intelligence agencies at least knew what was going on. But Trump might not have known. Now, there are two possibilities there. Nobody told him. They just kept him in the dark, because maybe there were rogue elements or something involved in this. That's a possibility. But the other possibility is that, they included in their daily briefings, their weekly report, all these kind of things. And he didn't pay any attention because that's what everybody's saying. He doesn't even show up to these things. He doesn't read the reports. Vance does, but he just, he watches Fox News or talks to his buddies or something. That's how he gets his information. It's extraordinary, but it's more than one, very well-connected source has said this already.
Yeah, and it's just a bit worrying because Trump has been oddly silent. Yeah. He's usually you can't get away from him. And all of a sudden this has happened and we haven't heard anything. There haven't been any clips of him going around making any comments on it, other than just sort of his inflammatory rhetoric that he aimed towards Putin a week or so ago about playing with fire. Mm-hmm. And now this happened and nothing. But I did see one thing that came out on Fox News last night with Keith Kellogg, and I played for you, and I want your thoughts on it.
Okay, sure.
And I'm telling you, the risk levels are going way up. I mean, what happened this weekend, people have to understand in the national security space, when you attack an opponent's part of their national survival system, which is their triad, the nuclear triad, that means your risk level goes up because you don't know what the other side's going to do. You're not sure. First of all, it was a very bold attack. And when you do that, it's very clear the risk levels will go up. And I think that's what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to get to a position where the risk levels are going so high that this thing will expand. And that's where we don't want to be.
So well, actually recently, Kellogg has made some very sensible comments, and that was very sensible. It's hard to fault him on that. I think he's right. It definitely did raise the risk level. And it was provocative. If we had to have known it was going on. We should have shut it down early. That's my feeling.
Yeah. Are you surprised though that he made those statements?
A little bit. I think it was a few days earlier that he made a statement about, expressing an understanding about what was it that, well, essentially recognizing that this was a proxy war and that the Russians understood it as such. And, again, that's an important story. We never heard, we heard Marco Rubio say that earlier. You never heard anything like that under Biden. So, those are positive developments. Actually, that's quite encouraging because, we've always pointed to Kellogg as being, the kind of the neocon, the old representative of the old thinking, the American hegemonic thinking close to Trump. And if he's saying these things, on TV, he's probably also telling Trump. And, that's good. Maybe it gives us reason to be hopeful that at the very least we'll try to, pull the Ukrainians back, that we won't lift the restrictions on the ATACMS, so that we will try to prevent the Taurus from being used, that kind of thing.
Yeah, or do you think it's possible that Trump and Putin are talking, or there's dialogue between the Trump administration and the Russians, and they're saying, hey, you guys went over the line here, what's going on? And now there's pressure on them to kind of cover themselves, be like, okay, yeah, this was too far. This is too much of an escalation.
That may be, it's just that may be actually what prompted them to make these statements is that, yeah, they understood the Russians gave them some very firm warnings and maybe warnings of retaliation. Maybe, again, they're not saying this publicly, but you say, hey, you guys crossed the line. If you don't, pull back on this, make clear that you recognize what happened and, assure us that this is not going to happen again. We're going to be forced to do something, really, we're going to be forced to escalate on our side. That's very possible, and that's maybe what led him to make the statement. And the fact that he did make the statement, whatever prompted him to, is a good sign.
Yeah, if that was the case, I think Putin is being naive to think, just don't do it again. We know how this game play works out. Maybe there's a slowdown for a little bit,
right.
But
again, there's been very little substantive change so far between the two administrations, but the one obvious change is the cessation of ATACMS strikes, right, in pre-2014 Russian territory.
Could that also just be because we ran out of them? We were already running low, right?
Yeah, we're running low,
and we don't make them anymore.
We're running low. That's true, and that may have contributed to our decision. But it's still something. We'll see. As long as that continues, I think that's something real, and the Russians recognize it and say, okay, maybe this is, we can deal with this administration. At least we can, keep this, maintain certain red lines and keep this war from turning into World War III. Maybe everything else is going to continue as like before. I don't think they really have any hopes, for example, that the negotiations will succeed. The war will continue, but at least it won't be World War III. I think they have reason to hope, at least there. And now, maybe that will all fall apart in the next couple of months. Maybe there'll be a Taurus strike next week, and then we'll know that, okay, we're just back to the Biden way of doing things. But that hasn't happened yet.
So you said what Kellogg said there, that's a positive development, but he also said what he said earlier about Ukraine being a proxy war was a positive development. How is him making the statement that's a proxy war a positive development?
Well, it's a recognition of the Russian position. And that's what he said. It's like the Russians have said this. And yeah, in a way, they're right. I think those were the words that he used. And again, you would just never get people like Jake Sullivan or Tony Blinken ever saying anything like that. Never admitting, the Russian position was valid to any degree whatsoever. So, yeah, it's a step towards recognizing, Russia's concerns and Russia's positions.
But it's also just openly saying that we're at war with Russia via a proxy. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's also scary, right? We don't want that. I mean,
right.
Before you had this in the shadows, you can say, whoa, that's that's when it was easier to walk away if there was no admission that was a proxy for Trump to be
Well,
like, we weren't involved. We just, I mean, everybody knew, but there wasn't this open admission from administrative officials.
right. Well, I think it's known, for example, I think like the great majority of U.S. voters will not be happy about us prosecuting a proxy war against Russia. And that's one reason why the previous administration always pretended that that wasn't going on. So you're right. This could go two ways. It could be a recognition of reality and of Russian concerns, and that we could see it as a positive development. It may be that, like we've talked about certain issues, let's say involving Israel, where yes, we just saw the masks drop. It's just like, okay, there always were these intentions, but we tried to have maintain a humanitarian kind of the pretense of some sort of humanitarian concern, and then the mask dropped, and you could say that that's what this could eventually lead to. Maybe I'm being naive, but my initial reaction is positive. And it shows that, the administration is listening to the Russians. I'd like to think that, maybe I'll be shown wrong, when, again, a couple of weeks from now, the Taurus missiles are striking the outskirts of Moscow, and then people are celebrating the fact that this is a proxy war and that we're doing it to the Russians.
Maybe I'm more of a half glass empty kind of guy on this.
Yeah.
It just feels like there is zero chance of a negotiated settlement now.
I agree.
10 days ago, I felt like there was still a chance, but what we've seen over the past 2 weeks or so, the negotiations are a farce. The only reason that they're happening is really just to appease Trump. It's to appease the Americans who play this game, but they're moving further apart through these negotiations. They're not moving closer. Since they've begun, we haven't really seen anything positive other than a few prisoner swaps.
Yeah. Well, that is something,
but the demands have been going,
right.
Right. They're not budging. They're going the wrong direction.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, that doesn't surprise me. I mean, that's the Russians have been just remarkably consistent about what their positions are, what their demands are. Yeah, ever since June of last year, and they haven't budged from them. And if anything, I guess if you look at this recent memorandum that was presented to the Ukrainian side in Istanbul, they've in fact hardened their position somewhat. But again, that doesn't surprise me. A lot of Russians and kind of supporters of Russia were worried that the Russians were softening their position, that Putin was going to agree to a Minsk III, so-called. There's no signs of that happening. That's, Putin has learned his lesson.
Do you think we're getting...
Go ahead.
Oh, so do you think we're getting to the point of no return for Trump to walk away from this conflict? To see how Trump responds to this incident, but if he stays quiet, or continues support, doesn't denounce some of the terrorist activities, or openly say that this was going too far, attacking Russia's nuclear triad, then that's it. We can say Trump has become Biden 2.0, and now he's committed to this project. Are we at that point yet?
I'm afraid it's like, I pointed out many times that it was always going to be very difficult for him to walk away from it. To walk away from it was a possibility. The settlement, I don't think, was ever possible. So he shouldn't have invested, really any of his capital or any of his time in efforts to negotiate a settlement, because it just never was going to go anywhere. I think that was foolish. If he could have maybe from the very start started to lay the groundwork for our disengagement from the so-called walking away. Now, that was going to be tough. Again, like I've pointed out many times, that when the consequence of our truly walking away would be an accelerated collapse of Ukrainian defenses. And then when you have, again, the Russian army, marching towards Kiev or Odessa or crossing the Dnieper, or any one of these things, or even just approaching the Dnieper, there's just going to be a huge amount of pressure on Trump to do something about it. And there'll be all kinds of accusations. Now, he should have understood that, but I think it was still possible for him to carry it out, but he was going to have to lay the groundwork, work hard on changing the narrative and so on and so forth. And you could say but again, he hasn't. His approach has been so chaotic. It's focused on the ceasefire, which was never going to happen. He hasn't laid the groundwork. And I think it's just made it impossible for him to walk away. I don't think he can. And unfortunately, I think probably, we'll see a continued funding of the war, even though that's not a popular step. I don't think he's going to have a choice because he can't be saddled with a defeat. He hasn't prepared. He hasn't explained. He should have, right from day one, say, this is Biden's war. This was stupid. It doesn't help America. Look, the Russians, and put enormous pressure on the Ukrainians, just made it crystal clear to them that, okay, we're not going to suspend weapons for 3 days. It's over, guys. You're just going to have to make a deal now. And I advise you to accept those Russian terms because it's going to get worse. They make that clear to everybody. Now, there would be a lot of anger about that, but it would be true. And then let's say, okay, the Ukrainians reject that. The Europeans reject it. The Ukrainians say, okay, it's your war. You want to do that. I tried to help you guys out. Okay, I'm out of here. And then when the Russians take 8 oblasts instead of 4, they say, look, I had this deal and you didn't, I think it would have been hard, but if you'd been very disciplined about it and it just said that from day one, I think he could have pulled it off. At least it was possible, and the settlement never was. But now, because he's wasted all his time, and he's been so all over the map in his statements. He's maybe punched a few holes in the narrative, but he hasn't fundamentally changed it. And I don't think it's now his war, and I think we're going to see it continue. Let's just hope that we don't have those escalations, like again the long range missile strikes.
I don't know. I feels riskier under Trump, to be honest. If he becomes invested in it, he seems to be someone that might act more, emotionally. It's scary. He said he doesn't want to be saddled with a defeat, but Russia is not going to lose this, right? There's no way Russia is going to lose, so he's going to be saddled with a defeat either way. It's just going to be a more humiliating defeat. Like you're just saying, like, hey, you could stop here and we could have this deal, but if we don't, it's going to get worse for you. It's going to get worse for Trump. The more it goes on, it's just going to continue to get worse. And then, you hope as a businessman, he would understand the sunk cost fallacy and quit throwing good money after bad in this project and good lives after dead lives with all these troops and stop it. But he might get to that point where you just get sucked in. That's the problem, was once you've gone too far, if you stop now, you're done. You're the person that kind of half committed and lost all these people, lost more territory. Right. But the reality is, if you stick with it, you're going to lose everything. You're going to lose more and more and more.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right.
Okay, well, that's so it's all up to Trump, and it sounds like Trump you think is probably going to commit. That's what it looks like.
I think he's letting himself be boxed in is what's happened. He just I think the time is fast running out for any kind of off ramp for him. The longer he stays there, the longer he doesn't do anything, the longer he talks about ceasefires and all that, the less likely that he's going to be able to walk away from it. I think it's already impossible. It's maybe not quite impossible now, but it will be if he continues down this path.
There might be one other wild card out there that could stop this conflict. And that's Elon Musk. Because from my understanding, Starlink is really what's keeping the Ukrainians in the fight. Their ability to operate the drones is due to their access to Starlink. And I've seen some videos about the warfare, and they say, Starlink is the only thing that the Russians recognize as the real problem on the battlefield. It's not any of the equipment that NATO is providing them or the U.S. is providing them. It's really Starlink. First of all, do you believe that's true? Like, how important has Starlink been to the Ukrainians?
I think it's very important. I think there's no question about it. It's probably, I wouldn't say that the other kinds of equipment didn't count. If they only had Starlink, but they didn't have any armored personnel carriers or howitzers or artillery shells, they still would lose. You could communicate with each other, but if you don't have any guns to fire, you can't wage war. So obviously they had to have those other things too. But that's probably been, that's the one system that they've had since the beginning that has really worked. The Russians have managed to disrupt it, and I think continue to disrupt it on occasion and locally. They have ways of, through their electronic warfare to actually interfere with the signals. But by and large, it seems to be a very reliable system, and generally impervious to eavesdropping and so forth. If they lost Starlink, the Russians would be able to just pretty much shut down their communications at will at different parts of the line, or to just listen in, and it would be over very quickly. Even if they had the best equipment in the world, I think that's true. So yes, Starlink is vital to their effort.
Right.
One of the things, probably Starlink and drones are the two, the two most important parts of the Ukraine's military effort.
Right, and I think without Starlink, their drones they wouldn't be able to use them effectively.
I think that's
Starlink.
Right.
So Starlink is keeping everything together really for Ukraine. Without that, they have nothing, and it's crazy that it's being provided by a private citizen. It's not, this isn't a part of the military-industrial complex, or it's not supposed to be. So Elon Musk does have that ability, right? Like he could shut it down, and that would quickly hasten the end of the war. That would be the defeat. And sure, he could get a lot of flack, but he probably would get a lot of support too. Elon Musk also has a big ego. It seems like he wants to be liked very much on X, but who knows? I mean, maybe that could be a popular move for him amongst the world. I think most of the world is on the side of Russia to end this conflict. People realize that the path that we're going down could lead to nuclear war. So,
yeah. Well, it is true. I mean, he's unpredictable. He's unlike most multi-billionaires. He's his own man. It doesn't mean everything he does is right by, I'm not arguing that at all, but he makes his own decisions, and occasionally, he surprises us, or quite often he does. He can do things that run against the grain, and he could do it. Of course, he has been critical of this war, of our support for Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And that has angered the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian political elite, and they have gone after him. They've which seems to me very, very stupid, to be honest. Again, it's sort of like the way the Ukrainians, it's just their natural reaction. They don't have any subtlety. And it's just, they're kind of like a rabid dog. If you poke them, they just turn around and snarl at you and then try to bite you. And that's of course what they did to Trump initially, until I think enough people got through to Zelensky and say, hey, you got to learn how to play Trump. You can't goad him. You can't insult him. Just don't do that. But they did that too. They insulted Musk. Now, Musk has shrugged it off. Obviously he's still providing this service, this vital service to the Ukrainian military. But one day he might shut it off. We'll see. I'm sure that he's looking at other things. That might be his inclination already, but he is very closely tied to the U.S. government. He has lots of, very large U.S. government contracts. And so he may, even if that's his inclination, that's his personal preference, he may just, for the sake of his businesses, say that, okay, I can't do this unless he gets some sort of green light from within the administration. And then I think he would feel empowered to do it.
Well, you told me that the Russians, the new S-500 or S-550, has the capability of shooting down satellites as well. I think Russia has the ability to shoot down satellites right now. If Starlink is being used for the Ukrainians, then are the Russians within their rights to shoot down these satellites? And it's something that they can threaten. It's like, and not only would it have a huge impact on the battlefield directly and hastening the end of this war, it would be further proof of Russia's strength, that they have this capability. Like, look, guys, we can shoot down your satellites. Don't play around here. Because we always see when Russia used the Oreshnik, I was watching the news then. They's like, oh, this was nothing, just fear mongering from Russia. They don't have anything advanced. It's just, this is baby tech. You know, that's kind of how they poo-poo it. When you start shooting satellites out of space, you can't spin it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's no question the Russians had that capability. There's no question whatsoever. And many people have pointed out that, you know, the fact that this is let's say, you know, it is at least technically, officially a war between Russia and Ukraine, it has been to Ukraine's advantage. If it became, you know, an all-out war between Russia and NATO, you know, already in a sense it is, but officially it's still Russia and Ukraine. You know, it's a proxy war. But if it went beyond that, then Russia would have no hesitation to take out those satellites, and that would actually be to their advantage. You know, the reason they're not doing it now is, again, it would be escalatory. It would be, you know, you would be striking down. You say Musk, you know, satellites, those belong to a private company, but a private company that's very, you know, closely associated with the United States government. And then there are also U.S. spy satellites that have been very, very important to the Ukrainians throughout this conflict. You know, it's essential. You know, that's where they get so much of their intelligence, their targeting data, and so on and so forth. It comes from those U.S. spy satellites. All those would come down if it actually turned into a Russia-NATO war. It just hasn't, because, again, Russia doesn't want to escalate to that point. But if it does, those satellites go, and that'll be to Russia's advantage. I mean, so it's actually. You know, that's one of the areas where, you know, we pointed at Starlink, but then also these spy satellites, the ones that are providing the intelligence data, that is also, you know, it's an area where Ukraine, if anything, has an edge over Russia, because the U.S., especially at the start of the conflicts, had more satellites up there than the Russians did, significantly more. Now, my understanding is the Russians, during the past 3 years, have closed the gap, but they're still behind. But that advantage would be entirely erased, again, if we did go to World War III, basically, you know, or Russia, NATO.
Does the U.S. have the ability to shoot down Russia satellites?
You know, I'm not sure. I think probably they do, but I'm not sure about that.
I'm not so sure anymore, just because I feel like
I know, again, the S-500 is supposed to have that capability, and I think I've heard many commentators say there's just no question the Russians can do that.
Right. Well, I mean, the fact that we still haven't developed hypersonic missiles, and it feels like after the space race, once we put a man on the moon, we just stopped rocket and missile development. It just didn't move. I mean, it just feels like we had that embarrassment. Boeing couldn't even get their rocket up to retrieve their own astronauts from the space station. You know, Elon Musk had to do it. It's just, so I don't know. Maybe we don't.
Yeah,
have
and for a long time, actually, I think finally, you know, we've managed to develop the technology to, you know, again, to supply, you know, the space station, that kind of thing. But for years and years, it was actually, we were dependent on the Russians to do it. They had the technology, they had the rocket engines, and we didn't. I think we may have finally caught up, you know, maybe thanks to Elon Musk. But for a long time, we just didn't have it. So yeah, you know, there's no question that they won the race to the moon, but yeah, maybe we've been sitting on our laurels ever since the 90s. Now, I remember, like, in the first Gulf War, we had what were back then were wonder weapons, or appeared to be, you know, these cruise missiles and so forth. And so, you know, again, rocket or missile technology had continued to develop, but it seems like there has, for whatever reason, we're just we're not able to develop a new technology the way that we once could. You know, you pointed out that the ATACMS are no longer produced. I think they were, like, our stockpile was basically built up in the first decade of the century, and then since then we've stopped producing them. And then, you know, they're one of our main missiles, but they're really pretty old now. It's fairly old technology. And then, yeah, we haven't been able to develop a successful hypersonic missile, and the Russians did that back in, I believe it was 2018.
Yeah. Yeah, and apparently like we said, the Houthis have more impressive missiles.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but they're impressive enough. I mean, it's extraordinary, you know.
Yeah. Okay, I want to go back to the drone attack on the planes. Do we have some clarification on how many were destroyed? I've been seeing basically the Ukrainian position is 41. A third of Russia's fleet has been destroyed. And then I also see, I think from the Russian side, it's saying that there were 2 destroyed and 5 damaged. And is the truth somewhere in between? Do we have any clarification?
Yeah, no, it isn't entirely clear. There are satellite images available, and different people go over them and say different things. I've heard at the low end that maybe only 2 were destroyed, right, and 3 were significantly damaged. I guess the figure that I go with is the one that Scott of Calibrated with Scott came up with. This is a guy who spends a lot of time looking at satellite images, and he's a very, very good mapper. And I found him to be really quite reliable, over the years. He generally, there's no question about it that like he's sympathetic to the Russian side, but I've always found him to be very, very honest. He doesn't ever try to minimize Ukrainian successes. And he's come up with a figure of approximately a dozen total, destroyed or seriously damaged planes, almost all of which are the Tu-95s. I think there was maybe one AN whatever, I think a reconnaissance plane that was also,
AWACS,
a dozen. Yeah, an AWAC basically.
Yeah.
So I find to be the most believable figure, a dozen. And again, that is significant damage, but but first, it'll have no impact on the war. They have plenty of Tu-95s to launch KH-101s in the future. It doesn't affect that. And, it's a loss, but it's not, in itself will have no impact on the war or very, very minor impact on Russia's ability to defend itself, from a larger attack. Again, I don't want to minimize this. This was successful. The Ukrainians got their licks in. It was a successful mission, but it wasn't devastating. It wasn't Pearl Harbor. It wasn't, all these things that you hear. It was nothing like that.
Do we know how these drones were controlled?
I believe that they were, again, they were FPV drones, and at least the initial report said that looking at the footage, it was clear that they were manually controlled. There was somebody nearby. Just as you would have like on the front lines, there's somebody in the woods or something, looking at a screen, visually confirming, the location of the bombers, and then instructing the FPV to strike it. And I think they used local cellular system. That's what you could actually see, like LTE appear on the screen. This is what they were getting, cellular signals. So I think they hacked into the local cellular systems.
Okay, that was going to be my question. If they were using Starlink, for example,
right,
then it's like, okay, time to shoot down your satellites, Elon.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Some people have made I don't know if they specifically said it was Starlink, but they've asserted that they must have used Western, satellites for this. And I just, again, we're in the very initial stages. We hear a lot of different reports. I haven't seen any evidence of that. The evidence that I've seen so far, and I admit that it's partial, is that it was done locally. And so it could have been carried out by the Ukrainians. This is something the Ukrainians are quite good at. Again, we see they're probably ahead of the U.S. when it comes to drone technology. These FPV drones in particular. And so it is something that they conceivably, I think, quite believably could have pulled off on themselves. Again, there had to be at least Western complicity, awareness, and approval, but I think that they could have done this on their own.
So what's next? What happens? We wait for Putin to, if he's just going to stay the course, which is quite possible, and they might just have maybe a surge and say that that's part of a retaliation to appease the public opinion in Russia. Say, look, we are doing something, but that doesn't really change the course. He's just going to fight the war. Right. Or, is there going to be something like an Oreshnik use, some demonstration of strength? Yeah.
Well, it's certainly possible. He may go to an Oreshnik just as, in a way, it would just be a show, but that's kind of just to counter the Ukrainian show. It's just sort of an information war. Again, he's shown very little interest in that. It seems like Putin doesn't even care about what people think or what, he's just looking at the substance. But maybe somebody will convince him, hey, you got to do this. We got to at least appease our own people. So, it could happen. We could have an Oreshnik strike, something like that. But one thing to keep in mind is that a major offensive will likely occur soon. That's what everybody seems to believe. And, clearly they have the capability of doing that. And that actually would be much more meaningful than any strike, I think, on Ukrainian territory. In a way that would, once that happens, and maybe it's going to happen, let's say in 2 weeks or something, everybody will really forget about the air base attacks. And they say, hey, the Russians have broken through the line into 3 different places, and they're marching towards the river, or they're marching towards Kiev or something like that. And then it's will be this whole thing, this affair that seems like such a big deal right now. And it is a big deal. I'm I don't want to say it's nothing. It was a very significant provocation, but it will probably be forgotten at that point.
If I was Putin, this is what I would do. So Putin, if you're listening, take notes. I would call up Elon and say, Elon, you need to stop providing Starlink. And if you don't, then we will shoot down your satellites. Either he takes them down or he doesn't. Then, okay, Starlink, as soon as Starlink goes down, you coincide that with a massive offensive. They have no communication, can't operate their drones. It's over. It's done. Boom. Then game over, right? Game over for the Ukraine. Once you take Starlink out, it's going to be complete chaos on the front lines. Then they'll just be able to roll through. They'll just be mass surrenders. The war will be over in a day. Do you think so?
Well, I don't think he's going to do it again, because that's not.
Well, I don't think he's going to do it.
Yeah,
but
right. Yeah. Well, but
that would work.
You know what I think? Yeah. But actually, I think that's an important point. Is that he has that card to play, and it's just that is something that may keep NATO at bay. That they're aware, like the moment they cross the border into Ukraine, that Russia can say, okay, this is no longer just between us and Ukraine. Those satellites are fair game, and take them down. And then again, NATO was never really going to make much of an impact, but then it would just be a total collapse. In fact, it would, like the entry of NATO troops would be, again, would just give the Russians the justification to take down those satellites, to remove the constraints, and they can win the war even more quickly. And it's something that perhaps it's been, I hope that certain Western intelligence agencies understand, and it may be one reason that, again, NATO is restraining itself, or hasn't taken the step so far. And we'll see.
Yeah,
I think that may be just a card that he wants to keep. He wants to play if it becomes necessary. He doesn't want to use it up right now.
I feel like NATO would send troops in a heartbeat if they had public support behind it. I think that's the only thing that's keeping them out of it. I don't think they're thinking. I don't know. It just doesn't feel like people in NATO. I don't feel like they really think other than just tunnel vision. We must destroy Ukraine. We must destroy Russia. That seems to be all they think about.
Well, again, it's like when you get a sensible comment on the reality of the conflict, it almost always comes from an actual military analyst or one of the defense departments. We get a lot of crazy departments from ex-generals and current generals and so on. But whenever you get a sensible comment, it also does seem to come out of those military departments. For example, we had Keir Starmer, just bloviating about British intervention in the conflict. And then it was, their equivalent of the Pentagon leaks information to the press and say, this is all theater. We don't have that capability. We basically hardly have an army, much less one that can confront the Russians. And that came from his military establishment.
I saw a headline this morning that the UK is going to provide Ukraine with 100,000 drones. So they say, and we'll see. I mean, I have a feeling if they do provide them with the drones, they'll probably be pretty garbage. Because from my understanding, like I think the U.S. provided things like Switchblade drones to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians just found them worthless. They just don't even bother with them. They just make them all themselves housed with Chinese parts. But I also heard that China now has restricted the export of these drone parts to Ukraine. So I don't know if that's having much of an impact, or is it simply that these drone parts are being sent to Romania or something like this, and just or Poland, and just pushed across the border for them? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, well, no, I heard the same report, which is quite interesting because of at the same time, it was reported that the Chinese are not restricting the export of these components, these drone components, to Russia. And up until this point, they've maintained this stance of strict neutrality, and in fact have again been like the main supplier of drone components to Ukraine throughout this war. So this shows a change of direction, and I think it just is probably a response to the obvious hostility of the U.S. to China. You say they're beginning to regard China, the U.S. as an enemy more than just an adversary. And so they're going to taking steps to more openly tilt towards the Russian side. Now, as you pointed out, it may be that the Ukrainians are still going to be able to get a hold of it because, that's the nature of international trade. I don't know if how possible it is or how severe and extensive the restrictions are going to be. As you point out, you could just, it's possible that some sort of shell company in Romania or anywhere could buy them and then just pass them on to the Ukrainians. It would be a slight delay and a slightly higher cost, but they could still get them. Yeah, unless they take, even more stringent measures. For example, they say from now on, these kind of components we only supply to Russia. Nobody else gets them. And then that would have I think a really devastating impact in Ukraine, but I don't know that they've gone that far.
I don't think so. What about Lindsey Graham's bone-crushing sanctions? Do you think this is still in play, that we might see? What bone-crushing sanctions are secondary sanctions. It's really penalizing China and India more than anybody else, and that just seems like such a stupid move for the West to make. But do you think that's still on the table?
Well, he's talking like it is. I mean, it just seems like every other day he's making these threats, and he claims to have 80 senators on his side. So he's ready to pass them at any time. He's chomping at the bit. He wants to introduce this legislation. He claims that it will pass. It's just absurd. Again, it's we had imposed 145%, or Trump had, on China just a couple of months ago, and then lifted them when we realized. I think what happened is that we saw that all these different goods, consumer goods, stopped appearing at the ports on the West Coast, and you could see disaster was impending. And Trump agreed to roll back, those tariffs. So we're now down at 30% from 145%. So you're telling me you're going to put 500%? Again, it's just such a ridiculous number. I remember the Chinese went to 125%. He said, we're not going any farther than this because this basically shuts it down. What's the point of going to 200, 300, 500? So it's just a silly number in a way. It just shuts down trade. 145% would have shut down trade. So it's like this recent tariff war never happened. But he seems to just, again, be living in the 1990s or the early 2000s, where we could have done something like this and probably China would have caved. But they've made it clear they're not. Don't you remember, Lindsay? It wasn't too long ago. We slapped on those 145%, and which would be the same as a 500%. And they said, we don't care. If you don't want to buy our goods, that's your problem. And there's no reason to think that the Chinese would react differently. And so if it does get passed, I'm sure like a month or two later, there are going to be cries to remove it when we start to realize the consequences. I think it's just amazing, the level of stupidity here. It's just shocking.
Can you help play out the consequences? What would happen if we did this?
Yeah, well, again, there's sanctions on any country that that would purchase Russian energy products of any kind, so oil, gas, uranium. Right? We import a lot of Russian uranium. That's one of the things that we continue to import from them. Now, what are the countries that import Russian oil and gas? Well, China is number one. India is another imports a lot of these energy products. But a third one is Europe. And which is funny because they're constantly, the Europeans are trying to slap new sanctions on Russian energy all the time. And they refuse to, their own pipeline was destroyed and they refused to, there's just, one pipeline, that is still actually could be used, but they refuse to use it. Yet they're forced to import large amounts of Russian oil and gas. And so they just have to, energy prices have doubled, tripled, quadrupled in some cases in Europe, with really severe economic effects. But it would be much worse if they were cut off completely from Russian energy. Now, these sanctions would cut Europe off from Russian energy, if the Europeans caved in and said, okay, we won't buy anymore. So it would be devastating above all to Europe, because they probably would feel like they have to cave in. China would go along, shrug it off. Again, they've shown that they're not afraid. And India, I don't know. It's hard to say, but so far, I think it's likely that they would ignore it too. I think so, because Russian energy is actually very, very important to them. I mean, cheap Russian energy has been, has kept their economy growing and has held inflation down, and they understand that the consequences would be devastating. And the Indians are proud too. They're, a great power. They're the most populous nation on the planet. And I think they just wouldn't take kindly to this kind of, ultimatum. So I think it would just be all around just a devastating, to the extent that it was abided by, it would be it would be devastating to the economies, for example, of Europe. And then it would be a humiliation to the U.S. in the case of these other economies. It's just a stupendously stupid idea.
Well, we're really good at those. So
yeah, right.
Who knows? It might happen. So if these countries just ignore it, China, India, the countries that really matter, what does that mean? Does it just further hammer home the fact that the U.S. just is impotent, cannot dictate what happens in the world anymore, and they are no longer the hegemon? Would that be the outcome?
Yeah, I think it started, of course, with the launch of the sanctions against Russia, the sanctions from hell, the sanctions that were supposed to turn the ruble into rubble. Russia survived it and is thriving, and that's the first. That in itself was a huge blow to U.S. hegemony. The whole world saw it. We fired our biggest cannon at Russia, and it just made a lot of smoke, and then the cannonball fell in the middle of the field, and did no damage. And everybody's saying, oh, wait a second. We were all expecting to see just, Russia in smoking ruins, and nothing happened. This is, maybe these people aren't as powerful as we thought. Clearly they're not. This would be a continuation of that. It would be, okay, now with a lot of huffing and puffing, a lot of beating of chests in the U.S. And, okay, here it is, the bone-crunching sanctions. Europe, once again, it seems like Europe is the one that is going to suffer from them. And the rest of the world will go on. And that's, the rest of the world will just learn to say, okay, we'd like to trade with the U.S., but if they're going to be like this, we've learned we don't have to. Now, there will be some smaller countries that are so dependent on the U.S. that they're just going to have to obey U.S., diktats. That will happen. But I don't think I'm sure China won't. I doubt that India will. I mean, there's some chance that India will somehow, try to work out a deal or whatever. They've kind of shown that tendency in the past. They did that during the tariff war. But again, if China doesn't, if China does not abide by them, if it does not cave in, and I just can't see how they will. They've proven that they um, earlier in the attempt to coerce them through the 145% tariffs that they will not. Um, that in itself is going to bring the U.S. to its knees again, because we just can't live without. Well, we could live without, but it's just going to be very painful living without Chinese goods. There's going to be a lot of anger in the U.S., when we can't get all these cheap Chinese goods that we've learned to rely on.
If China and India ignore it, what would the U.S. do in response to that? Could they do anything, or would they just look really stupid?
Yeah, they really can't. I mean, what else can they do? You say, well, okay, you don't want to. You're going to slap. Okay, you slapped your 500% tariffs. We're still buying it. Okay, that's it. Now, what are you going to do? What can they do? Yeah, and then finally, it's just like in India. India doesn't have the leverage that China does. Because we do buy some goods from India, but it's just not nearly as much as we do from China. But China does have that leverage. They just do. So it's just like, you have made a big mistake. You fired your big cannon again, the one that made all that smoke. When it was fired against the Russians, you'll do it again, and then the Chinese can come back, and they've got the leverage. They we owe them money and we depend on their goods. And so what are you doing? It's just like you don't understand what the situation is here.
Right. I mean, India has some leverage. They can tell, okay, every single U.S. company, no more call center support. It's over. They're done. Right. I mean, I'm serious. That would cause a panic amongst everybody.
Right. Though I think it's also probably an important source of income to India.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
It's just, it's so stupid. I'll focus just on the military aspect often and look at it, but then, we kind of forget about these other things that are at play, what's going to happen first? Are we going to just see a military defeat that's going to bring down the U.S. empire? Are we going to see an economic collapse first that'll bring down the American empire? Or are we going to see just more and more social unrest as we see liberties being eroded in the United States, as we continue to support what's happening in Gaza? Will that lead to the end of the empire? It's like, which one's going to happen first? Or are they all going to happen at the same time? Because they're all slowly happening at the same time. We're seeing all three of those economic collapse, our three pillar theory, right? So which one's going to happen first? What do you think?
Which one will happen first? Well, my guess would be the economic, and that's the one that's going to really get people's attention. But nobody has a crystal ball. You never know what's right around the corner. Just like the events of the last few days show that again. None of us expected attack on Russian strategic bombers and so there's just, who knows? It's just that we live in that kind of uncertain world. But if you force me to put my money on one of those three, I would put it on the economic. If especially if we go ahead with the so-called bone-crushing sanctions.
Okay, well, maybe we can dive into that some more later. I'd like to explore the economic collapse, especially if you think that if you had put your money on that, maybe we should give some more attention to it. But we'll leave that for a future chat.
Okay.
Is there anything you want to touch on before we sign off?
No. Nothing in particular, no.
Iran that's still confusing and chaotic. Yeah. Gaza is still just an awful tragedy. It continues.
Right. Yeah, I guess I would just say in the case of Gaza, there have been reports that of massacres right there at those limited distribution sites. And of course, the IDF has basically denied them, though they've made some kind of ambiguous statements about firing at people who were not in the designated lanes or something. So, starving people that are approaching, one of these very limited food distribution or humanitarian assistance distribution sites. They wandered from the designated lanes to get shot at. This is... So, we're talking about dozens and dozens of people that were massacred, apparently, close to these sites. Israel in general has denied it, but the reports, the claims that are made by Hamas have been backed up with a lot of reports. So just you find, the journalists that are there ask people, and they describe the same thing. What they describe does support the the Hamas government claims, and you're also getting reports from the hospitals, and they're saying, yeah, that's how many people dead and wounded were brought in as a result of these massacres. So I think it's real, and it's again, it's just beyond horrifying.
Yeah, the horror just never ends. Okay, well, we can talk about that some more later as well.
Okay.
Okay, let's end it there.
Okay.
Okay, have a good rest of your day.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.